In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the power steering rack and pinion on this Toyota 4Runner. Just so you know, after this job you'll need an alignment. Before we start disassembling anything, I'm going to tie off the steering wheel so it doesn't spin around. We're going to have the steering shaft disconnected, so it's important to keep the steering wheel from making a bunch of turns. It'll damage the clock spring. I like to use the seat belt because it's already here, but if you want to use a bungee cord or anything else, go ahead. And just once you put it in here, buckle it. Might have to move the seat forward a little. With it buckled, just pull the seat back so it holds it nice and sturdy. To start, let's remove the wheel. Typically, you'll have a 21mm lug nut, but these are not factory wheels. So for me, I'm going to use a 19mm. Regardless of your size, remove all 6 of your lug nuts, and then we'll remove the wheel. Now that we have the wheel off, let's loosen up the jam nut that locks in the inner with the outer tie rods. I'm using an adjustable wrench because I don't have a large enough wrench to fit over this. My tie rods are somewhat new, so this breaks free easily. You don't have to remove it all the way, just break it free so you can take the outer tie rod off the inner. Now let's remove the cotter pin off of the end of the tie rod on the knuckle side. If your cotter pin is not new, a lot of times they get rusted in here, so you may have to cut it off and then hammer a socket over it. It'll just break the cotter pin loose that way. I'm going to use a 22mm socket on this. This tie rod has been replaced, so yours might be a different size mounting nut, but whatever it is, take it off. I'm going to leave it on here just a couple threads so that as we hammer the knuckle here to break the stud free, it doesn't fall down. There we go, that popped free. Remove the nut, pull the tie rod off, and now we want to take it off of the inner tie rod. The one thing you do want to pay attention to is the amount of turns that it takes to remove this one. Obviously you'll need an alignment still, but if you put it back the same amount of turns, you'll get closer to a decent alignment so you can safely drive to your local alignment shop. I had 19 turns. Of course, for you, that might be different. Whatever you had, memorize it or write it down somewhere. Now just do the same to the other side. Take the outer tie rod off. Now underneath the vehicle, we'll disconnect the steering shaft. There are multiple ways of doing this. I like to disconnect the rag joint here. This is the one that has the damper built into it. You have a bolt up here that connects it to the top of the steering shaft, and then this one on the bottom. They're both 12mm headed bolts. This one connects it to the steering rack. I'm going to start at the bottom. Doesn't really matter where you start, but take them both off. There's one. If they're in poor condition, this one does seem rusty, but it's decent. If I clean it up, I'm going to reuse it. If yours is rotted, definitely replace it. And there's the top one. I'm going to take a pry bar now. Tap it from underneath here. Make sure you don't damage anything as you're hammering up, but basically you want to slide this whole joint up on the steering shaft. If yours doesn't come off with a pry bar and a hammer, it's probably because of rust. I'm going to use an air chisel and just gently try to vibrate it until it comes off of here. Okay. There we go. Now we have to unbolt the steering rack so we can pull it away so we can get to the lines. I'm I'm going to start on the passenger side. There's a bracket that's held on with a 19mm nut and a 19mm bolt. Take both of these out. There's the bolt. And there's the nut. One thing I want to mention is as you pull this bracket off, sometimes you might need a pry bar for this, but these two shanks here are different sizes. The lower one that goes on the nut side is longer. The top one that gets the bolt put through it is shorter. So you want to make sure you put those back the right way. Otherwise, if you put the shorter one on the bottom, the nut will bottom out on the threads before it actually gets tightened. Next, we have a bolt that is kind of hidden. You can get it from the top here. You'll see the threads at the bottom. It's a 19mm, and you'll need a swivel head, long ratchet to get to it. It's pretty much the only way you'll get it. You'll have to go between the sway bar and the transmission pan. There we go. These are pretty tight, which is why I said you'll need a long ratchet. Okay. And once you have it broken free, sometimes you can switch to a shorter ratchet. This is actually so loose that I can just probably take it out by hand. Yeah. There's the bolt. On the driver's side, you'll see a 22mm nut. This is actually a bolt that goes all the way through the frame. You may or may not have to hold the head of it, which you can reach just on the other side right here. I'm gonna try not to, but if it starts spinning in place, I'll have to hold it with a 22mm wrench. Okay, looks like mine stayed in place. The nut came off, that's perfect. Push the bolt through. There is a washer that sits here, so make sure you save that. Now with a pry bar, gently try and pry this away. Make sure you don't bend your skid plate. Sometimes you can get into this bushing here where the bolt comes in from up top, and just be careful what you're prying on. You don't want to damage other components that are in the way, and you're not going to be able to pull it off completely because of course the lines are still connected, but this is why we're pulling it off, so we can get to those lines. As you can see, they're pretty jammed in there. So at this point, you can pull the steering rack back. I'm going to want to get this bolt out of the steering rack. You can just reach up through here and pull it out that way towards the front of the vehicle. And then this can move around, pull it back just enough. It'll come out of this bushing in the middle. I have some pieces of wood laying around here. These are going to be perfect for me to keep this spaced off of the frame. I'm going to put them in here and just stack them. This will keep it away so that we can get to these lines up here much easier. Now, yes, this is going to move around, but this is basically the only way we're going to be able to do it. Let's start with the top line. I recommend using a flare nut wrench because it grabs onto one extra side than an open-ended, and you're less likely to strip out the fitting. This is a 17mm flare nut. Try to break it free. Okay, that broke free. That's great. Switch to an open-ended when you can. It'll be a lot easier to maneuver and position the wrench up in there. Now I'm going to try and take this hose clamp off of the hose that goes to this top line because our line is spinning, and I'm just going to pop the hose off. Now, once I take the clamp off, before I completely remove the hose, I'm going to want to put a collection bucket underneath. I think I got the clamp off enough to where I can pry the hose off of this line now. Be very gentle if you have to do this. You don't want to damage the hose, or the line really, because we have to transfer it to the new power steering rack. And now that we got the clamp off of there, let's push the hose back. I'm using a pry bar, but I'm going to be very gentle. So now that the hose is off, we can spin this line off freely. Now I can spin it by hand. Some fluid may drip out of here as soon as this comes out. There it is. Now let's try and loosen up the other line. This one is significantly rustier, so hopefully it breaks free. And I'm also using a 17mm flare nut wrench on this one, just like we used on the other one. After working it for a little bit with some leverage, I was able to break the fitting free from the threads. However, the problem is the line is spinning with the fitting. It's hard to see because the whole rack is moving, but it is. And in order to save that line, we have to break it free from the fitting. Looking at it, for us, it might not happen. So just as a disclaimer, if ours breaks, we're gonna have to replace it. Hopefully yours doesn't. At this point, the line and the fitting here for the pressure side is completely seized. The threads are broken free, but the line is seized to the fitting. So I'm just gonna cut it off, and then we will install a new line. When you cut it off, if you're using a reciprocating saw, just be careful. If you're using a hand saw, it'll take a little bit longer, but you have less of a chance of hitting other things. So whatever you're using, just be careful. So this is cut now. Obviously, if your line was not rusted, you would remove it from the fitting and leave it onto the vehicle. Like I said, for us, we had to do this. Now I can remove my wooden blocks. Now you can grab the steering rack and just find the angle that it wants to slide out at and slide it out. There it is. So here's our new power steering rack. What we want to do now is center the rack. What that means is you want to make sure that internally it is sticking out equally on both ends. Otherwise, your steering wheel is going to be straight like we centered it at the beginning of the video, but the rack is going to be offset, so you're not going to be able to turn as much one way as you would the other way. It's important that you do this. So take off this protective boot, and I like to use some locking pliers, but very gently clamp it down. And I'm going to only clamp it down on the top here, not on the splines. I don't want to damage those. Just like that. And I'm just going to go all the way to one side until it stops. Okay, so now remember the position of your locking pliers, and then turn it until it stops the other way, but count the amount of turns. So we have 1, 2, 3, and a half. So 3.5 turns is what it takes to go from lock to lock. Now divide that by 2, turn it back that amount, and that's how it's centered. So that would be 1 3/4. So we have 1.5 and 1/4. Now it won't be perfect, especially since these splines are even all around, but if you're 1 tooth off, that's what the alignment professional is going to do. Everything's going to get centered after you go there. So if you're 1 tooth off, that's okay, but try your best to get it centered. This is optional, but I'm actually going to remove, well, not remove, I'm going to lower this shield down on the back side here. I'm going to leave it bolted onto the front, but if I just unbolt the 2 rear bolts, which is here and here, 2 12mm headed bolts, it's going to allow me to slide the rack in a lot better without scraping it or damaging it. I'm actually going to use a 1/2-inch socket just because my bolts are, well, slightly damaged and they're not even the original ones. Okay, that's one side and the other. Like I said, it's not going to come off, but it will tilt out of our way. Now we have plenty of space to slide the new rack in without scraping it or damaging it. On the passenger side, it can rest on this stud here in the middle. I'm going to line it up with this bushing. I don't want to bolt it in yet, but I want it secured here. And now if we put this shield back, it can actually rest on the shield as we maneuver everything else around. But removing this was just to get better access to install it. Resecure the shield. Make sure you snug up the hardware. Now, on the new power steering rack, let's remove these 2 little caps that they put on for shipping. I'm just using a pick. They are threaded, so they just thread into the existing threads on the power steering rack. Sometimes they're a little tricky to get. This one's actually a little broken, but once you break it free, you should be able to easily unthread it and set those aside so we can put the lines on. There's one of them. There we go. Take off the top one. There we go. Now we can put our lines on. Now let's put on the lower hose. Try to line it up the best you can. This might be a little bit difficult because, as you can see, the line and the rack are at two different angles, so try to angle it to line up the threads. That'll be the trickiest part of this process here. So one thing I want to try is pushing this large bolt through and actually putting it into the steering rack, although I don't want to push the steering rack all the way in. I want to pull it out as far as it'll go, because I'm hoping this bolt will actually help us line up the line and the rack the way they're meant to sit. So with that in, let's try again. Like I said, this will be the most challenging part. I can get my stubby wrench now. Okay, I'm pretty sure I got it started. It's threading on nice and smooth. Took a little bit, but like I said, the key here is to line it up perfectly, otherwise the threads will never start. And once they do, this rack being aluminum, it is very important to not cross thread, because it is actually easy to cross thread aluminum, and if you don't pay attention, you won't even know. Make sure that when you spin it like this, the line itself doesn't twist. I'm going to hold it with a pry bar very gently. I don't want to bend it or damage it in any way, but I just want to prevent it from spinning so I can just spin the fitting, not the line with it. Okay, just give it a good snug here. Okay, perfect, just like that. Now we can put on the top fitting. The low pressure return hose, the top one, I just pulled out through the area where the axle goes through, and I'm gonna slide my clamp on. You have to reuse the original clamp. If yours isn't good, you'll just have to get yourself a new one. Slide it over the hose. Oh, there we go. Make sure it's far back enough to where you can slide the fitting on. The way I'm gonna do it is I'm gonna slide the fitting on and then thread it onto the power steering rack. Okay, that should be good for now. Let's slide the fitting on. Here's the fitting. I'm going to slide it onto the hose. This might be a little tricky, seeing that this is a brand new hose, so it's a little tighter than the original one that we took off. But make sure it's fully seated. Right here has this bevel. Make sure it goes on all the way until it hits that. That's how you know it's fully seated. I'd say that's pretty good right there. Let's grab the clamp, and you'll see that this right here where it bulges, that's the end of the fitting. This is the end of the hose. Line up the clamp right in the middle. Open. There we go. Right there. Perfect. Again, if your clamp is weak or damaged, replace it. Bend the hose and put it back in here. Try not to get any debris in it. And now it should come out this side, and it'll reach the power steering rack perfectly, although I do have to push it in a little more. There we go. Slide it into its fitting at the top here, and try to line up the threads. This might be a little tricky and challenging because they have to line up perfectly, but with enough trial and error, it'll start. Start it by hand. Make sure you don't cross thread this. Grab a 17mm wrench and tighten it up. Okay, that's bottomed out right there. Make sure you snug it up, not more than 1/4 of a turn total. That's it right there, about 1/4 of a turn after it bottomed out. At this point, I'm going to put the steering shaft back on because we can still move the rack around, so it might be a little bit easier to do it now as opposed to later. I'm gonna grab a pry bar and pry right through the between the frame and the sway bar here. Just pry up on this, kind of hook it over. There we go, that's on. And at this point, all we have to do is just tap it back down. If your steering shaft was not as rusty, maybe at this point you could just grab it and pull it down. Unfortunately, that is not the case for me. Also, one more thing to note is before you actually go down on these splines, make sure that your steering rack is still centered, steering wheel is still straight. I know both of those are good because we have the steering wheel tied off and we just centered the steering rack, and I can visually see that it's equal on both sides. So just double check all that. Again, if you're a couple teeth off, that's no big deal. The alignment will take care of that, but you just want to make sure you're not a whole turn off. Take a hammer, gently tap it down. You can see this cutout here. That is where the bolt has to line up. That's why the cutout is here, so the bolt can actually slide through. If you have it lined up with the splines, you cannot put the bolt in. Take a pry bar if the tapping doesn't work, and just very gently pry it down right between the frame and the steering joint itself. Don't pry too hard, you don't want to break anything. And maybe combine that with some taps of the hammer. You just want to kind of slide it down and over. I know it's engaged on the splines, but it's kind of stuck on the rust that's built up there. Now from the top, I'm going to set the pry bar at the top of the steering shaft joint and tap it down from here, because from the bottom it's a little too rusty for me to be able to safely pull it down without destroying that rubber joint in there. I switched to a long air chisel bit. I'm going to go very gentle, but I'm hoping the vibrations will actually help push it down. Yep. Perfect. Now that we've pushed it back down from up top, I do still have a little bit left to go, but I can do this with a hammer. Just push it down. Some more taps. There we go. I'm trying to pull it down at the same time. Notice how it wants to spring back when I let go. So that tells me that it does slide, and most likely it is now fully seated at this point because this is not going down anymore. So the way to know is, let's just try to put the bolt in. If the bolt slides in, you know it's seated, because if it wasn't, the bolt wouldn't slide in. And there you have it. Bolt slides in, threads on perfectly. So at this point, I know everything is still centered. I'm just going to leave it in. We're going to put the top one in as well. I did put anti-seize on the bolt. I cleaned up the rust. If yours aren't rusty, then I guess you're better off. And if yours are rotted, actually, you definitely want to replace them, because this is all that's holding the steering shaft together. So let's thread these on. Okay, top one's threading in perfectly. In order to double check this, I'm just going to use a small 1/4-inch ratchet to ensure that the threads are going in nicely, and they are. I'm just going to bottom it out like this, and then we'll grab the torque wrench and torque it. I'll do the same to the bottom one. Yeah, this is all going in nice and smoothly, so that's perfect. Let's torque this. 26 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these. Doesn't matter which one you do first. I'm just going to start at the bottom. That's one. And two. Now that we have the steering shaft connected, let's put the rack back in. I'm going to start by putting in the center bolt, because this centers everything up. So push it in and then drop the bolt down from up top. This one, you won't be able to see much of what's happening there, so you kind of have to feel for it. However, Once it falls through, you should be able to smoothly thread it on, and you'll see it poke out through the bottom once the threads get in there and start catching on. There we go. We'll just bottom that out. And this one does have a torque, but I will not be able to torque this because my torque wrench doesn't fit in there. So I will only be torquing these, just so you know. Now, let's push this large bolt through all the way. Remember, this had a washer and then the mounting nut. This was the 22 millimeter mounting nut. If this line is in the way, you can kind of bend it up just a little bit. It won't hurt anything, but you definitely would, but you're better off bending it up out of the way a little bit than rubbing your socket on it and potentially damaging it. Okay, this is on. Not going to tighten this yet. Let's put the other side on. Don't forget to transfer over your old rubber bushing here. Obviously, if you have a new one, just use that. I put silicone paste on the inside to prevent water from building up in there and rotting out the steering rack. A lot of times this happens. Our old rack was actually pretty severely pitted here. So put on some silicone paste if you have some. And I prefer to put the slit at the bottom. That way any moisture or debris that gets in there can just drip right down. And you want to just slide this behind the rack, line it up with the bracket on the frame here, just like so. All right, there we go, perfect. And now I actually added some silicone paste to the outside as well, because that will allow us to slide this bracket on a lot easier. It'll kind of just glide over the rubber piece, just like that. The bolt goes on the top, and remember, the longer shank was on the bottom. Just a little reminder. Line up the bolt, make sure it threads in, then take the nut, put that on the bottom, and now let's bottom everything out and torque it. 22 millimeter for this one. Most of the time you won't have to hold the bolt, but if you do, just put a wrench on the back side. You'll have access to it right there. And now the 19 millimeter bolt that goes from the top. Again, I will not be torquing this one just because I don't have a torque wrench that fits in here. So I'm just going to make it as tight as I can. I'd say that's pretty tight right there. I had some good leverage with this ratchet, so that's done. 96 foot-pounds is the torque for this large through bolt here. Okay, looks like mine is spinning on the backside, so I'll have to put a wrench on it. I'm holding the bolt from the backside. $96 right there, perfect. Let's move on to the bracket. $123 for both of these, the nut and the bolt. That's one. No extension needed for that top one. And that's two. And technically, the bolt in the middle was also 123, but like I said, can't torque that one. Now before we install the tie rod, I like to put a little bit of anti-seize in the threads here, just because the climate this car lives in, it's very likely that these will seize together, so I want to avoid that. And now, take the tie rod and put it back the same amount of turns that it took to take it off. Now take the tie rod stud and line it up, put it through the knuckle, put your castle nut back on, let's bottom it out and torque it to 67 foot-pounds. .67 foot-pounds. That's it right there. And now to line up the slot of the cotter pin with the castle nut, just keep tightening. You don't want to loosen to do that. Looks like we're almost there. Give it a little extra. Perfect. Grab a new cotter pin, slide it through, and bend it over to lock it in. take your adjustable wrench, or if you have a wrench that's large enough to fit over here, tighten this up. There we go. Give it a little extra. And now I'm going to bring it back so that the tie rod can sit even with the knuckle here. There we go, just like that. Let's get the wheels on. Get all 6 of your lug nuts on, bottom them out, and torque them to 76 foot-pounds. Okay. "76 foot-pounds in a cross pattern." There you have it. Now it's time to fill the system. This is your power steering reservoir on the passenger side of the engine, right by the radiator. Take the cap off. You'll notice that right on the cap it says to use Dexron type automatic transmission fluid. Do not use power steering fluid for this. If you absolutely have to, you can, but flush it out later. This being a steel reservoir, it's a little bit difficult to see, so I'm just going to look from the top and fill it almost to the top, but not all the way, because otherwise it will spill as we bleed it. I'm going to use a funnel, that way I avoid making a mess. The system is not going to take a whole lot. I would be surprised if it takes more than a whole quart to fill up, so just keep that in mind. Now that we have it almost full, I'm going to raise the vehicle up so the front wheels are slightly off the ground, and we're going to turn the steering wheel lock to lock, meaning all the way from one side to all the way to the other side with the engine off. This will manually push the air out of the system and the fluid through, and we'll top it off as needed. Back inside the vehicle, let's undo the seat belt. Pull it off the steering wheel. Everything's safe now. Now, like I said, turn the steering wheel lock to lock, meaning all the way to one side and all the way to the other side. And this will bleed the system manually. Now, we will do this with the engine on later, but I want to make sure that the air comes out with the engine off. Otherwise, the power steering pump is going to suck in a lot of air, aerate the fluid, and potentially damage the pump. Another thing to note here is this is exactly why I jacked up the vehicle. Well, mine's on the lift, so I just lifted it, but you want the front wheels off the ground so you can easily spin them. Otherwise, you'll be fighting the pressure of the weight of the vehicle on the wheels, which, well, if you can make this easier, why not? I'm just going to do this a few more times, then we will go check the level of the fluid. Most likely it will have gone down, and we'll add accordingly. The reservoir is completely empty now, so I'm just going to add more fluid to it, bring it up to the top, just like it was before. Okay, that's pretty full, so let's do the procedure again. I'm just going to keep doing this until air stops coming out and fluid stops going down. That's when I know that manually I've done everything I could, so it's time to start the engine. Now that it's bled manually, top it off if it isn't already, and turn on the engine and do the same exact thing. Just keep turning the steering wheel left and right all the way until air bubbles stop coming out. Then, once it's time to cap it off because you're done, this is also your dipstick to check the level. On one side, it'll say hot. That's where it will be when the fluid is hot. It does expand a little bit. And on the other side, it's a cold fill. You can use either of them, but most likely if you already ran it, it'll be on the hot side. Make sure the fluid level is between the two ends of these marks. If it is, that's perfect. If it's too high, just take some out. If it's too low, well, add some. At that point, once you have it filled perfectly, cap it off, take it for a road test.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.